So I've been told we can start. Stop your cameras, people. Okay, then. What do we say? Good afternoon. Well, hello, I should say, because it's for people in this room. So welcome to all our colleagues and friends in this room here in Guildford, and to all our colleagues and friends online. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to this conference on behalf of everybody in the Center for Translation Studies here in Guildford at the University of Surrey, to welcome you to our first Convergence conference. It's an event that has been in the making for a long time. It in fact started with a funding bid that we submitted in 2019 to expand our center's research into the interaction and integration of human agents and machine capabilities in translation and interpreting. We promised that we would bring together colleagues to discuss and share research in this area here in Surrey. Well, by the time that we were awarded the funding, thankfully, and we were ready to make more detailed plans for the conference, the time for organizing any on-site event was, of course, not right. Paradoxically, though, the technologies that we wanted to discuss and that we were interested in investigating were, of course, evolving rapidly at that time, and in the last few years, partly due to the pandemic restrictions, which has boosted all our collaborative online working, and of course led to an exponential growth in online content, multimodal content, audiovisual content, and partly, of course, due to the rapid advancement simply in the last few years of technologies, especially of AI-driven technologies. And these are only some of the developments, I think, that have had a major impact on translation and interpreting in recent years. This whole digital transformation in our societies started much earlier and has disrupted the language industry for quite some time and in quite profound ways. And more recently, of course, the world has changed in other ways, from peace in Europe to war, to a cost of living crisis, a climate crisis, an economic outlook that is much more pessimistic than many of us would have hoped and believed even a couple of years ago. At the same time, and perhaps in part because of these developments, digitalization of our society, linguistic demand, linguistic and cultural diversity are increasing globally. Certainly, we trade, we communicate across borders, we consume global news online, we interact in social media, or we access entertainment, regardless of where it is produced. Or we are migrants and refugees, fleeing war and humanitarian crisis, and we need access to critical information in our host country in a language that we can understand. Or we need access to some type of content in a specific format, in easy to understand language, through subtitles, assistive commentaries like description. Managing this linguistic demand and linguistic and cultural diversity has become an important cornerstone for many societies. And traditional ways of providing language services and human resource alone cannot always meet this demand because of costs, but also because of labor shortages or skills gaps. Now, without subscribing to any form of technological solutionism, it is crucial, I think, though, that we do explore in much more depth, first of all, how we can leverage different technologies to support or improve language solutions in a smart and responsible manner. And secondly, that we have an open debate about how the optimal balance between human and machine capabilities can work in different scenarios in different contexts. That, of course, requires a nuanced and evidence-based approach. The complexity of that debate is often exacerbated by the notion that AI-driven technologies compete with human intelligence, which has fueled a discourse of humans and machines opposing each other as opposing forces, when I think in reality they may be strongest when they are combined. This is why we need a collaboration between human-based and technology-enhanced approaches to translation and interpreting. This is why we need convergence. So 2 years ago, we set up our Convergence lecture as a series, as a forum for discussion of this topic. And today, I'm very pleased to welcome many colleagues here who have contributed to the series over the past 2 years, and coming from it to different angles, but certainly sharing a common interest in how we can harness that full potential of different language-related technologies responsibly and in an ethical manner. At this conference, we hope to continue and broaden this discussion. An important part of our convergence concept is certainly to contribute to the development of language services that are effective, sustainable, and accessible, without compromising the quality of these services, and certainly without compromising the physical, mental, and socioeconomic well-being of those who provide these services and those who use them. We look forward to all your contributions and a lively discussion on this topic in the next few days. We have 2 keynote speeches today and tomorrow, each adding a unique perspective on this topic. This will then be complemented by 8 panel sessions and a final discussion on Friday. We will also have a poster exhibition where we selfishly showcase the research in our Center for Translation Studies, the very exciting range of projects that our 20 or so PhD students are working on at the moment, and equally exciting, the research projects that my colleagues in CTS are working on. Our on-site participants, so all of you here in the room, you can visit the poster exhibition today at the end of this day, also tomorrow during the lunch breaks at the reception, and of course also on Friday. To our on-site participants, you will be able to access our posters online in the next few days. Although our online participants will not be able to join us for the reception tomorrow, I do hope that our wonderful post-pandemic hybrid conference format, which has been some time to work out, has taken some time to work out, but I hope it will work for everyone, both technically and in terms of participation. And that brings me to a few housekeeping rules. Social media. We are featuring our conference on social media. Would we not? If you want to join the debate, please use our hashtag Convergence23. Correct? Just checking. Okay, word on health and safety. We are not really expecting any fire alarm tests. So if the fire alarm goes off, this will be real, I'm afraid. And then please stay calm. Please follow us to get out of this building as soon as we can. Zoom. Right now, and for the keynotes, we are using the webinar version of Zoom. This means that our online participants can post questions, can read each other's questions, and can upvote, as that is called, upvote questions that you find interesting. We will hopefully questions and questions at the end of the keynote speeches, and we will happily take questions both from the floor and from online. Subtitles. There will be live subtitles delivered by the team of re-speakers from a substream during the keynote speeches and in the re-speaking panel this afternoon, and also in the media accessibility panel tomorrow. For the online participants, the subtitles will appear on screen, or if they are not there, you can turn them on by clicking on the CC Show Caption icon. You can also change the caption size. You need to click on that little arrow and then go into the settings. You can move the position of the captions on your screen by hovering over the caption box and clicking and dragging it along. For on-site participants, the subtitles will not be on screen during the keynotes for a technical reason, but you can access them by using text on tap. you have the QR code on your tables, or also the printout of the link to them on the tables. So if you follow that link, you will get an explanation of everything you need to know to follow our subtitles for these sessions. Recordings, we will record the sessions for teaching and research purposes in Surrey. If you prefer not to be in the picture, then position yourselves behind the camera or switch your video off, please. Final note on this, to all presenters, please, if you haven't done so yet, email your presentations to the session chairs as soon as you are able to, as soon as you have finished them, yes. Okay. Okay. So, change of mode due to a glitch in my own, shall we, yeah. Right, sorry for the rather long list of housekeeping issues, but here we go. So now, moving swiftly on, it is my great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Dorothy Kenny. Usually at this point, people say, Dorothy doesn't need an introduction, but of course we introduce you, and of course you don't need an introduction. Dorothy is a full professor of translation studies at Dublin City University. Dorothy is not only a distinguished scholar in our field, she also incorporates the very idea, I think, of combining human and machine-based approaches to translation. Interestingly, Dorothy holds a BA in French and German from DCU, as well as an MSc in machine translation and a PhD in language engineering, both from the University of Manchester. Dorothy has worked on many corpus-related translation topics, on machine-assisted translation, computer-aided translation, as we used to call it, machine translation, translation theory, and certainly also on translator training. I remember distinctly a lecture that you gave in Edinburgh some years, Dorothy, some years ago, when you highlighted that the question is not, I checked my notes, the question is not whether we should teach neural machine translation, but how we should teach it. And how, you also asked, how much mathematics do we need to teach for it? I was a little bit scared by that. But you also asked this question, what do we say to students about why they would study translation in the age of neural machine translation? And of course, very recently, Dorothy has been the principal investigator in the Multi-Train MT project, machine translation training for multilingual citizens, a European project which has explored these questions and which has given us really interesting resources for learning about machine translation. One of these resources is a further great addition to Dorothy's impressive track record of publications, the edited volume Machine Translation for Everyone, Empowering Users in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, published last year. I'm very happy and grateful that you have accepted our invitation to be our keynote speaker. And not only that, but also to contribute to our workshop this morning. We are exhausting you quite a bit today. I very much look forward to your thoughts. Dorothy will raise the question whether and where convergence in human and machine translation is happening, and whether convergence in practice can be mirrored by convergence in research to a meeting of human translation studies and machine translation research. Please let me give the floor to Dorothy. Human and machine translation, a meeting of modes and minds. Thank you.
So I just want to start by thanking Sabina and her team for the very kind invitation. I was thrilled to come to Surrey, not for the first time. Yes, Surrey has been throughout my career a constant source of inspiration, advice, support. So thank you to everyone here. So that's the first thing I want to do, is to say thank you for the invitation. The second thing I want to do is to wish you all a very happy St. Bridget's Day. It mightn't be on your calendar, but today, the 1st of February, is St. Bridget's Day. And St. Bridget, in a remarkable act of convergence, was both a Celtic goddess and one of the most important saints in the early Christian church. So she carried that off. We like her a lot in Ireland at the moment because we've just got a new public holiday to celebrate St. Bridget's Day. So that's on Monday, we're celebrating that. Okay, so my talk is, the title's there behind you, on human and machine translation, a meeting of modes and minds. And I thought I'd start by saying a little bit about the idea of convergence. So yeah, the dictionary definitions, here are two, one British, one American, talk about things coming together, becoming similar. So, you know, there's a logical connection between them in similarity, but also a kind of an ontological connection. It's contiguity, things are coming together. Of course, convergence, in some descriptions, can be described as leading towards union or uniformity. And you can feel translation scholars' hackles rising when you talk about uniformity. And then there's the kind of technical understanding of convergence as the merging of distinct technologies, or several technologies appearing together or being integrated together in a single platform, etc. There are other meanings of convergence, of course, in biology, etc., but we'll stay away from them. So there's some food for thought here already. The coming together, the ideas of uniformity, and of course the ideas of related to technology. So within translation studies, and in particular in translation technology, I think a lot of people are used to the idea of technological conversion. So, you know, for a long time we've had lots of different but related technologies being offered together to the user in single platforms. These are familiar to all of you. Behind it all, of course, there's digitization, which helps in the kind of a sort of uniform representation of all of the different types of information that we're being fed. And yeah, more recently, I think the use of neural networks has kind of consolidated that, because we know now, but it's now possible, for example, to integrate image into text translation. You know, we can get the information we need, not just from the words, but also other types of semiotic codes, if you like. Convergence in translation studies has been studied in areas like news translation. This is one of the, I mean, if you look up convergence translation studies, this is one of the sources that you will find. And what I find really interesting about this source is that there is very much a focus on what's not uniform. Okay, so Davier and Conway talk about convergence being a chameleon. You know, it changes color depending on the particular region, mediascape, organization. Okay, so there's a kind of counter tendency there to anyone who's inclined to think this is about uniformization. They really stress the idea that, as well as being multi-platform, convergence in news translation anyway is very much a multimodal, a multilingual phenomenon, and it's a process. And yeah, so it's less uniform than you might think. Okay, and it doesn't take much effort to find instances of, you know, convergence in news. So you will have, for example, the web edition of a legacy, or well, kind of a print newspaper. This is an example from the Irish Times. pulling on a story that's that's based on social media, and then commenting on that. So this one is Lionel Messi's famous Instagram post that beat all records for likes, yeah, after the World Cup finished in just late last year. And it's been said, I think Roberto Valdeon said it, that the more channels there are, the more chance there is that translation is going to get mentioned or be present, yeah, sometimes explicitly. And in this case, I don't know why the thing wants me to press Alt, but I'll do that. In this case, what caught my eye was, yeah, an Instagram post, which is actually in Spanish. And the newspaper report tells us that Messi said something in Spanish, although it's repeated in English. In this case, the English is extraordinarily odd. I think they got it from Twitter, to tell you the truth. And it's not self-evidently a machine translation because, you know, DeepL or Google, which would be the obvious one, will give you something much better than this, you know. But the thing that's really interesting is, you know, all of the different channels coming together and translation being very present, very, very visible, and actually called out. Yeah, so he said it in Spanish, but we've just written it in English. Somebody must have translated. Okay, so right, so convergence, it's very much a part of the contemporary landscape. It's familiar to us. And the thing that I want to really reflect on is, what has translation studies more generally made of this? And in particular, to the extent that machine translation and human translation, if we can call it that, have come together, where has this happened? And is it in practice, or is it also in theory? So they're the things that I kind of want to look at now. But I'm going to go back a decade, yeah? So only 12 years ago, Minako O'Hagan, in a piece that she wrote on translation technology, said that despite, you know, all of the increasing evidence, even at the time of technology really impinging upon every area of translation practice, despite Sharon O'Hagan talking about, or excuse me, Sharon O'Brien talking about translation being a kind of, well, professional translation being a form of human-computer interaction, despite Michael Cronin famously talking about translational cyborgs. Despite all of those things, Minako O'Hagan said that, yeah, it's the academic discipline of translation studies has barely been touched by technology. So that was 10 years ago. Right. So when I think about this and, you know, my own observation of trends over the last several decades, I do recall at general translation studies conferences, so not ones that were focused on technology or localization, yeah, but the big generalist kind of conferences, papers that focus specifically on technology were quite thin on the ground. Now, I actually looked back at the programs for the International Association of Translation and Intercultural Studies back 4 conferences to Belfast 2012. I could have gone back further, but I couldn't find a digital copy of the programs for the other ones. And I would just be relying on my memory, and that might not be a good idea. But what you see is incredibly a massive growth in the last 1 or 2 years in papers on technology in generalist conferences. I think, like, if you look at the European Society for Translation Studies, you'll see similar phenomena. Brazil in 2015 was notable. I think there were a lot of Brazilians doing interesting work, but that they're not the only people to account for her, that kind of taller pillar in 2015. The one that really interested me was Barcelona 2021. Anyone who's been around as long as I have was stunned at just the number of papers on translation technology in this generalist conference. So I think technology has definitely arrived, you know, in very broad terms. There are also lots of fairly recent publications within translation studies, okay, that really reflect on technology, often from a kind of a sociological point of view, often looking through a very critical lens, looking at, for example, economic impacts, ethical repercussions, etc., of the integration, of the increasing digitization and integration of technology. There are a number of people in this room who've contributed to these conversations, and long may they continue. So at the moment, there's a lot of work also in progress that continues on this kind of critical strand, and that looks at the economic, the sociological, etc. And there's one project that's highlighted here that's particularly close to my heart, and I'm assuming to Felix de Carmo's as well, and Mary Norman's, because they're co-editors. An issue of translation spaces where we're specifically asking people to look at the very definition of translation, yeah, and how it can integrate machine translation. So there's a lot happening at the moment, which is a very good thing. Another area that's been astounding in the past maybe 3 or 4 years has been how machine translation is now routinely spoken about in areas that, you know, 10 years ago, people would have said machine translation had nothing to do with. So a really good example is literary translation. I've selected just a handful of the workshops that have taken place in France, Belgium, Ireland, the UK, over the past small number of years to kind of highlight this phenomenon. So definitely the empirical facts of, you know, who's talking about what suggest a real coming together. Okay, so here's where the navel gazing starts, I guess. Okay, if these areas are coming together without saying, you know, is there increasing uniformity or anything like that, if they're just merely coming together, where does this leave scholarship in translation studies, you know, that pre-exists or that predates the recent flourishing of this kind of interaction? And in what ways, you know, which ways are the ideas going? Are they coming from machine translation into translation studies? Are they going the other way? How prepared are we to integrate the others' conceptualizations, etc.? These are interesting questions. So let's take the first one that's listed here. You know, what evidence do we have about the capacity of machine translation research to integrate ideas that are very much associated with kind of more humanities-based translation studies? So here are just a couple of examples of this happening. So unsurprisingly, I guess, with machine translation being data-driven or corpus-based or corpus-driven, some of the ideas that have come into machine translation research are those that were promulgated within corpus-based translation studies, and the areas from which it took a lot of its core ideas. So Antonio Toral, for example, when he's writing about what he calls post-edities, as do others, draws on Mona Baker, corpus-based translation studies, and Gideon Toury's descriptive translation studies, and uses concepts like translation universals and laws of translation. So there is a kind of an attraction in those kind of universalist ideas. On the other hand, we have, again, Toral, Way, Toral and Way, Morkins et al., who, in looking at the machine translation of literary translation, also draw in, you know, classics of translation studies like Nida and Tabor's 1969 work, and the idea of dynamic or functional equivalence. So yeah, there are ideas going in. I think it's quite slow though, yeah? And that most of the traffic is probably coming the other way. Okay, so this is ancient history to a lot of people. But so when we reflect on the other side of it, how good is translation studies, how good is, translation studies at integrating all of these new developments? Well, in one way, you could say that, you know, theorists like Catford, who wrote about textual equivalence in the 1960s, which was an empirical phenomenon which was ascertained on the basis of source texts and their translations as you actually find them, and who anticipated machine translation based on this kind of resource. His approach seems completely compatible with contemporary data-driven machine translation. He also is a Firthian, even though, you know, often this isn't acknowledged about the book. His approach to meaning is very much one that's based on a distributional kind of usage-based understanding. And, you know, he talks about the meaning of a linguistic form being the network of relations it enters into with other linguistic forms, but also with the entire world practically. Yeah, so it's not just a linguistic phenomenon. But what he does predict is that when, you know, machine translation is based on corpora, your source, your target, that the machine will use a very co-text-based approach. So it's the words around the words that are going to make the important networks, whereas the human being is going to use a very loose kind of contextually informed approach. So again, he seems to really be the prophet when it comes to neural machine translation in particular. We have other theorists whose approach was so accommodating. Again, I mentioned Gideon Toury in this regard, who is, you know, the main proponent of descriptive translation studies. So his approach was anything that is presented or regarded as a translation is, on whatever grounds, is fair game. This is what translation studies should be studying. So most translation these days is machine translation. You know, of course, you know, it belongs within descriptive translation studies because it's presented and regarded as translation. Of course, you know, one of the other big ideas from Toury is the idea of norms. So patterns that you can actually see in your corpus are evidence of norms in operation. So his approach can definitely accommodate machine translation. Okay, so one of the people who's done a lot of thinking recently about these ideas of what branches of translation studies, because translation studies is a very broad area. So what branches can actually, I'll use the word again, accommodate machine translation, and has, for example, looked at the explanatory power of, you know, the equivalence-based theories, the kind of older 1960s ones, scopos, the idea of the purpose of the translation being the most important criterion in any kind of hierarchy. Post-structuralist theories as well, which are very skeptical about any kind of solid, stable texts or meanings. And, you know, interrogated each one and says, well, what can these help explain about machine translation? He also has a forthcoming article where he looks at descriptive translation studies in particular. So in what I'm about to say, there will be some overlap with some of the ideas that Asher has brought up and others that aren't in his papers. But I definitely wanted just to acknowledge those inputs to my thinking here. So one way you can look at this question is to look at those theorists, go back and look at your, you know, your post-structuralists or Tory or whoever, and then see how does this accommodate machine translation. Another way to look at the whole cloud of questions that emerges here is to take maybe themes. And so that's what I'm going to do in just the rest of this talk, is talk a little bit about some of the themes that keep coming up when we talk about technology, translation, or that should come up, but maybe don't come up often enough. So one of them is visibility, and this is in a way the most obvious. It's been, it's well-trodden territory in translation studies. So, for example, Lawrence Venuti's work is basically it's a campaign to ensure greater visibility for translators and translation. And one of the effects of ubiquitous translation, I guess now, and convergence is that translation has become more visible. You know, when you're interfacing with many platforms, you are told, okay, automatic translation is on now, yeah? If you want to find out more, go here. Yeah. We also have with audiovisual translation for Anglophones in particular, having become a much bigger part of our lives, thanks to streaming services, Netflix and the like. So Anglophones are now getting used to subtitles, for example, and mainstream media are explaining how subtitles work and the different types of subtitles to lay audiences, if you like. Yes, it's become much more visible. And this is an object of inquiry in itself. Sometimes machine translation is accused of kind of promulgating a myth of stable text, stable meanings, objective meanings. And it doesn't do so well on the kind of values that post-structuralist translation theories promote. So, you know, things like contingency. And it can't account maybe for instability. This probably isn't true, okay? So Asher in particular looks at variability and says, well, you know, machine translations can vary over time, but this depends on them being retrained unless you've some kind of adaptive system, yeah? Variability is also built in a little bit in the area of domain adaptation, for example. The efforts that are made to, adapt outputs to maybe different author styles or different kind of technical domains, legal, medical, whatever. All of this comes from provenance, though. It's all the training data that does this generally. And style equals provenance. Where did it come from? Then it's that person's style, you know, or that domain style, whatever. One of the things that Asher argues is that it's not great yet at varying on the base of the end user, which Scopus theory might prioritize. So yeah, but these ideas are in there. Another way that, if you like, text meanings can be destabilized in a very kind of post-structuralist way is that machine translation actually gives you the option to see alternatives in a way that human translation very rarely does. Yeah. So when we were undergrads, for example, if you put down 2 possible translations of a word in the source text, you'd lose marks, you know? Knowing more was not a good thing. You know, it was better to know one thing, not lots of things, not about variation. Yeah. Whereas machine translation systems can do that. And, you know, if you get an output that you don't like, you can say, well, can I have another one? Systems that allow you to look under the hood a bit as well will show you the N best translations. So this is a screen. You might just be able to see it from the interface that was developed for the multi-train MT project. It's called Moot NMT. And one of the things that we want students to do is to see what else, what was scored slightly less, you know, as a possible translation of this sentence. So this is a great way of stressing contingency, or, you know, it depends, like, what are you looking for? You know, like, the system thought this, can you work out why? Well, maybe if you can't, it doesn't matter. But the idea that lots of possibilities were generated is one that machine translation is actually quite good at exposing. This kind of idea is used in sometimes unexpected places. I listened to a presentation by a scholar called Tim Beale talking about Bible translation, and how it was kind of what he desired was to have, to use a machine translation system that would generate lots of different translations of the book of Genesis. And it was just to keep on trying to, you know, jolt people out of received ideas, if you like. So to prevent closure, to stop, there being one answer. And machine translation was seen as a really good solution for doing that. Okay. This is me really reflecting on what we were trying to teach students in the multi-train MT project. And in the introduction to the book, one of the things I wrote, which I'll stand by because it's, you know, it's reductive, but it's reductive for a purpose. So one of the things that I wrote was, look, translation is huge. You know, it's such a vast area. The way we can look at it are vast as well. If you want to know about translation, go to an encyclopedia of translation studies. You'll see the wealth of, you know, ideas covered. For this book, all we want you to know is translation can be data. Okay, so basically, what I was trying to do was to get students to accept that what we're looking at here are the kind of material traces of complex processes that have all sorts of implications for all sorts of people in the world. But we're just looking at the material traces. We're just looking at the data that it leaves behind. Yeah. So it's reductive, but it's reductive for a purpose. But what it doesn't do is account for a process. And there's a lot of translation studies research now that's very processual. Yeah. So it's really focused on process and, you know, informed by certain branches of philosophy. And so we end up reifying, you know, kind of making something that's abstract, that's process, that's kind of emergent, that's always in flux. We end up making it kind of very concrete. So, yeah. Okay, another one of the themes that comes across is that I can't use this very well. Okay, yeah. So augmentation. Okay, so when you're looking at sources that bring human and machine together, you know, a number of years ago, the main kind of new idea, if you like, was this idea of augmentation, often associated with common sense advisory. And their particular depiction of this is a human-centric kind of ecosystem with lots of tools informing all the things that the human does. And they also produced very nice graphics. In a very recent article, one that hasn't been published yet, Sharon O'Brien takes issue with the kind of the novelty of this, saying that all of those tools already exist. Yeah, you know, and actually the model as depicted in a lot of these sources doesn't say anything about how these tools actually augment the translator's cognitive capacities. How you know, what kind of way they're feeding into relieving, for example, cognitive load or stress or whatever. But they don't say much about this at all. And in her work, what she does is she actually begins to envisage devices that would monitor the translator's current state, initiate possible mitigations in cases of, for example, cognitive overload. And all of this is happening in real time. Of course, what's imagined there means that this kind of augmentation has to be going on with an actual embodied, situated translator working with their tools. So it's an approach that's very consistent with what's known as 4EA. So, you know, that cognition is, you know, embedded, embodied, extended, enacted, affective. Yeah. So, and it's definitely one to watch. Other ways of looking at augmentation really intrigued me. This is a paper on archives by a group of people, university and Microsoft writers. And what they're interested in is augmenting scientists, research scientists' cognition. So making it easier for them to discover what they need, ask new questions, design new experiments or whatever. But what interested me was the research side, because translators do that as well. Yeah. So a lot of our tools are, you know, kind of productivity tools, but often, even if you're using machine translation, you have to go off and do research. Sometimes you know it's wrong, but you don't know what the right answer is. You're going to have to go to some source outside. So so this is why it interested me. Their approach to augmenting cognition is one that's based on digital text, basically. So they posit an outer world, which is like all of the scientific papers that you know that are out there in the world, all of the comment on them, the kind of the comments that signal high value or whatever. Is an outer world. And then there's the scientist's inner world, the scientist's knowledge, the scientist's bias, the scientist singular, you know, their own cognitive state. But it's only accessed through textual traces that they leave. So the queries that they write, or they, you know, other kind of very personal and sometimes quite ephemeral, but digital texts. And they see, they want technologies that can bridge between this outer textual world and this kind of inner world that's proxied by digital texts as well. One of the things that they desire, or they think this would be a good thing to build, is a kind of a universal ontology, right? And yeah, so this brings me to the universalism point. So universalism is a theme that runs through translation studies from way back, okay? And Alice Leal captures it nicely in a piece in the Routledge Handbook of translation and philosophy, okay? And talks about universalist theories presupposing a common public source of meaning that's shared by all natural tongues, and that theorists in this vein tend to strive to find a create, or to create, if you can't find it, you can make it, a stable, reliable source of meaning, to unlock the mystery of the functioning of language, to find its lost origin, or to create a logical system, an ideal language to rid natural languages of their elusive character. And this can ultimately be understood as the search for objective translatability and equivalence amongst language. So where do we find this? I think most people remember Google's 2016 post where they generated these beautiful graphs that no one could understand. And then there was all of this commentary on this particular breakthrough where even Wired magazine were saying Google have discovered or created their own universal language. So what Leibniz and Descartes couldn't do, Google's just done. And there was a lot of skepticism about that. And I think in this room, for example, Felix Ducarmo has talked about myths, and this has to be one. Going back to the scholars I just mentioned a while ago with who were looking at augmenting research scientists' cognition, as I said, one of the things that they seem to want to do is to represent or to come up with a universal schema for representing scientific ideas. Now, they know that this goes back years or centuries. They actually refer to Descartes and Leibniz. And they say, well, it's not within reach, envisioning, yeah, they said, its existence and what may be needed to even roughly approximate it points to important research directions. So they're still hankering after a universal ontology, if you like, a conceptual scheme. And as we saw in machine translation research that's informed by translation studies, again, there was an attraction, a pull exerted by the idea of universals. Okay. So I'm coming to a close now, but so all of this makes me kind of reflect on, okay, where's this going? How are we going to pursue study of convergence of machine and human translation? In translation studies with an asterisk, a la Maria Tomoshko, who uses that to mean very broad concept, probably not, the restricted concept you have in your head at the moment. So will we return to universalism? There's no reason why that has to be the case. I think the news translation people remind us this is a chameleon-like phenomenon. It's going to keep on changing. Will we get more curious about the processes rather than using reified translation all the time? Yeah. So in corpora. Yeah. Will we continue our meta-theoretical exploration? So theorizing about theory, talking about which theories help us understand more what's going on. Will we see more situated, embodied explorations where, we get the kind of treatment of augmentation that Sharon O'Brien talks about? These are all really interesting questions. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you. And again, in Irish, you're wished happy, lá éile bríde. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dorothy. I thought that would be food for thought, and I thought you would bring in some ontological questions around the concept of convergence. Thank you so much. I'm opening this up for questions. First of all, questions from within the room before we see online questions. Ruslan, you make the start. We'll just get your microphone just to be on the safe side.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the very interesting and stimulating presentation. I really enjoyed it. One thing that I wanted to comment on, you mentioned translation universals and universalism at the end. So there have been various studies, including my own studies, which have blown the myths of translation universals. They don't exist. This is why people speak more about translationese recently. So do you agree with this? And obviously it has been empirically, experimentally shown that, for instance, convergence unfortunately doesn't hold as a translation universal. Simplification doesn't hold. Thank you.
Absolutely. So there's your work, which is really interesting. I know that Heidi is here as well. Heidi Gotze work, and probably other colleagues here have looked at these phenomena. And yeah, I think that a lot of the earlier work is seen as not nuanced, insufficiently informed by the multiple factors that are at play, it's very, very hard to say that something is universal. You know, you just find some exceptions and it's no longer universal. So it's never been something that I have particularly wanted to argue myself. So like years ago, I looked at, for example, normalization, but I didn't call it a universal. It was a feature of translation. And, you know, in the work I did, it depended entirely on the translator and what they saw as their particular agenda. So yeah, you know, to say something doesn't exist, I can't say that either, you know, but I don't think that there's compelling evidence that you'll always find very particular features regardless. And if you do find some of them, this is where Heidi would be a better spokesperson than I would. If you do find evidence of certain, you know, certain textual features, they mightn't be caused by translation, you know, it could be due to something else. So yeah, I'd be slightly skeptical myself. Yeah. So
do we have other comments on that from yourself? No.
I was going to comment on the same thing.
Yeah.
You mentioned the borrowing. You know, O'Brien said that we are the borrowers, and we keep borrowing from MT and the industry without criticizing, sometimes analyzing much. And the other way around, I was talking about this to Antonio Toral and others, how some of these concepts, what Ruslan mentioned, like if you go to translation studies, publications 2004, 2003, this is already dispelled. And I see how they're borrowing concepts in MT nowadays without really going back to what translation studies did back then, and they were like sort of applying it inconsistently, or like translationese they use it in a very fuzzy way. Do you think we can do better to apply concepts to try to like have an impact on MT research from our side? In a way, I don't know, we're the small discipline.
Yes, in fairness, I think, you know, in a way, it's good to see some ideas going the other way. But, you know, it would be nice if it was more nuanced and it took into account up-to-date scholarship, definitely. But it's a start, you know, and there are other issues with the idea of post-edites anyway, for me. You could, you know, it suggests that post-editing is the cause, but you can't isolate machine. Well, some projects probably can, but mostly it's the machine translation as the cause. It can't be isolated from the post-editing as the cause. So, yeah, more nuanced would be nice. We love nuance.
Yes, we do. Who is next? Felix? Yes.
Hi, thank you very much. Fantastic talk, as always. I'm thinking, yes, where are we going in terms of retrieving these concepts that have been going around, and they seem to require recreation. I'm thinking about equivalence, right? And from the beginning, it had this notion of dynamics, right? When we look at these, we're still looking at the products of processes, right? And even this notion of dynamic equivalence had the notion that it was created, built. Can we really see how it was built with only looking at the product? Isn't this why we are increasingly looking at the process? Because we see it happening in machine translation, and we have to go back and see how was it happening in human translation?
Yeah, I think it's a very good reason to look at the process. Looking at process is very difficult, though. Yeah, so but you have a lot of, well, you can use self-report, you can use what translators think they're doing, but yeah, it's difficult. And I suppose people like NIDA, you know, while it was kind of in a way prescriptive, because NIDA is very clear, we want natural expression in the target language. You can never have the equivalent effect, and you know that's priority. You know, so it's not. I mean, it's not disinterested kind of, as we know, research, but it is honest in that it says what he would do and why he would do it. But yeah, more process would be great.
We need, oh, sorry, I'm Heidi first. Oh, sorry, where's the microphone? Con Heidi first, up there.
Sorry, thank you. Well, just maybe to comment on this issue of universalism again, and universals of translation. So ideas like universals and translationese and so on are kind of zombie concepts in translation studies, and I'll talk a bit about that on Friday as well. And it's interesting to see how these concepts keep on coming back, even though, there has been a lot more work and a lot of very sophisticated work, both conceptually and empirically, since those early papers in the 1990s. You know, people keep kind of going back to those old ideas, kind of ignoring everything that's sort of happened in between. And it's a curious question of why that happens. Gertrude Sutter and Marie Audlefer have written a great paper on this, and sort of, you know, ascribing it very much to the disciplinary dynamics of translation studies as well. But at this juncture then, when we're talking about crossovers between these different areas of research, between machine translation and corpus-based translation studies or translation studies, you know, the question is then how are these concepts migrating, and which versions of these concepts are being sort of appropriated and why? And I think that's a really crucial question, is to sort of go back to, well, what are these concepts? What do they really mean? Why do we need them? Do we need to revivify these zombie concepts? Do we need to maybe slay them? You know, sort of once and forever drive a stake through their hearts. But you know, it's really curious to sort of hear these sorts of things coming back again.
Yeah, I think in translation studies, in early corpus-based translation studies, of course, we went for low-hanging fruit, you know, and a computer scientist can also go for low-hanging fruit, but just on a much larger scale, you know. So, and it might seem more compelling, you know, because, you know, something can be shown, or you know, you can get a result that accounts for a lot of the data. And then how you interpret it it's still, you know, type token ratio tells you about variation, but it doesn't tell you about complexity, you know what I mean? So but they can just get a lot of that fruit on a scale that we never imagined. Yeah.
And I think maybe this is a question, right? So where does an understanding of how language functions figure in all of this? Because to me, that interpretation question, so how do you interpret these patterns that you observe, whether you observe them in small scale or large scale, how do you interpret these patterns? To me, the question is, well, what sort of a thing do you think language is then? And that is what you will go to in terms of the interpretation. I wonder how you see, theories of language figuring this. I was really interested to see you talk about Catford and kind of mention usage-based approaches and so on. Do you see that maybe as a sort of a common framework that might inform this sort of research, crossover, convergence?
Absolutely. From the very outset, I think, of statistical approaches to natural language processing, Firth starts getting mentioned, and Wittgenstein and usage get mentioned, So for those people who are actually, for whom that's a priority, because it's, if you're in LLP, that's not necessarily your priority. But these would be, and of course, the distributional semantics was mentioned this morning, these would be the areas where you're going to find common ground. Yeah. So, so approaches to language and meaning based on those ideas.
But they're also much more down to earth than the universals, if then they are there. Yeah. This is perhaps also not the right level, even if there were, explicitation and those things. What would we do with them? How would we inject that into machine translation if they were there? So now you've come one level down, the actual sort of really digging into the language and into patterns rather than universals. That's also a different.
Yes,
that's also a different thing. Yeah. Right, Kat, and we've been asked online whether we could introduce ourselves, please, for the people who are online when we ask questions. So, Kat Verkouturen.
Yes, thank you. I must say that the last few days I've been going through a kind of identity crisis, and my questions related to that because of in the era of machine translation, I think the position the position of the translator has changed fundamentally. I think maybe not the first and probably not the last change, but what I'm missing a bit in the debate so far is exactly this positional change of the translator. And I don't know, is there any literature on how translators perceive themselves and this shift?
Miguel is nodding as if he's, are you? No. I thought we were answering this question. Yeah. So self-perceptions of translators in the current environment, you mean in the kind of more technologized environment? I know, some of the work that I do with Marion Winters in Harriet Watt is with a particular literary translator, and I guess implicitly, we've got some data on his self-perception, and it's of a very empowered person who is entitled to use whatever technology is available to him in order to do the best job. But very often, the technology can help with some things, but not with others. But wider studies of self-perception. I know there are studies of translators using technologies. There are kind of ethnographic studies of, but whether they focus on self-perception, I'm not really sure.
Or even more in general on the position within the entire translation process and everything it involves with the tools.
Yeah. I don't know if there's somebody here who's thinking of a particular paper that I'm not thinking of. Yeah. So Lucas Vieira's automation anxiety, or translators automation anxiety. That would be a good example. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I'm looking at Joss Morkins there. That's the title of one of your papers, but it's not about self-perception, is it? No, it's about the idea of digital Taylorism. So, yeah.
We have one question from we have some questions from the online audience also, and I want to pick one, okay? So Selçuk has asked, basically also saying that machine translation scholars almost make no references to translation studies and shouldn't we have a mutual understanding or convergence with programmers and computer scientists somehow? After all, they are the ones who gatekeep the way machine translation works. How can we penetrate their understanding of translation? So, I mean, to my mind, that is part of the question that is really important for me when I think about convergence in the first place. But I would like to know your thoughts around this.
Well, you know, first they have to want to change. You know, that why would translation theory be important when actually, you know, just say to somebody doing machine translation, so creating the systems, when what's actually important is learning algorithms. You know, if that's your, you know, that's what they have to be really good at. You know. If then you're kind of importing ideas from another area, I mean, we do it too. You know, I'm sure, for example, sociologists are sometimes taken aback at how Bourdieu is so huge in translation studies, you know, so yeah, but how do we penetrate their world? You know, well, you can't force people to,
maybe
but you can critique, you can critique the work. They're not published in the same in the same outlets, you see. So if you know, if something that was based on the idea of universals, but you know, cited not papers from 1993, but not from 2018 or whatever, and that came to a translation studies journal, the person reviewing it might make a comment. But if it's going to a machine translation reviewer, they might think, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that existed. You know, so yeah.
So now I see hands up. Very short, half a minute. Otherwise, we run out of time. First, Ruslan, and then Anna.
Thank you. This point exists in every discipline. I have been recently involved in computational phraseology. The same lack of talking between linguists working in phraseology and NLP people. The same happens in corpus linguistics. Those NLP colleagues of mine call any little data set of 10 words a corpus. I mean, things like this. I mean, those things are paradoxical, but they exist, and no wonder it happens here as well. And it's a shame, of course. We need to talk more to each other. And this conference is good for this.
Thank you. That's what I wanted to hear. Thank you, Ruslan. Ruslan Mitkov, sorry, you should say Anna. Anna Frankenberg-Garcia, our very own Anna. Final comment goes to you.
Thank you for the honor. I think this communication gap between machine translation and translation studies, we also have to take into account that the translation studies community is a very small community compared to this enormous world of AI and translation technologies. And we are a small community publishing mostly long single author papers in journals that are simply not discoverable or not widely discoverable. So if I may, I would like to make a call to use keywords and to make, I think we need to deliberately make our research more discoverable to our colleagues from MT. That's just a comment.
Interesting comment. Of course, I think there are many implications for those disciplines that we want to come together. And I mean, I could not agree more. This is simply we are not particularly savvy there sometimes in the way we sell our products, so to speak. But maybe these are also questions for our final discussion panel. So this is a call from me to everybody to think about what are your questions for the final panel, either to keep them to yourself until the panel, or if you really want them to be answered, then send them to us beforehand, to Konstantin and myself, and to Felix and myself. We will happily ponder about them with you at the panel on Friday, once you had the chance to rest and to think more about this, and with others. Thank you very much for, I'm afraid we are out of time. So thank you for the online participation. There were some that we didn't catch and probably also some questions that we didn't catch here, but thank you very much for this inspiring talk. I have the feeling now that we are running out of time, we really just get going with our communication, with our discussion, but we will continue this on, well, during these next few days and certainly on Friday. Thank you very much.
Thank you.